speakers. My name's May Fateman. I'm the Director of Financial Justice Ireland, and I'm just going to start with a very short introduction to who we are as an organisation, for those of you who don't know us, and what we're hoping to discuss today as well. So we're a global financial justice organisation working toward a fair financial and economic system. And we have been going since the early 90s. Our name used to be Debt and Development Coalition Ireland, and we were founded as part of the Jubilee 2000 debt forgiveness campaign that was focused on calling out the injustice of countries in the global south who were dealing with legacy debts, in many cases going back to the time of colonialism, with huge interest rates which they couldn't get out of. So we've been working ever since then on the issue of sovereign debt. So that's debt that countries owe other countries, the global financial infrastructure around that, and other issues like tax and tax justice, and things like public-private partnerships and other things like that. So we work since the start of the last decade. For about the last 10 years, we've been looking at how these issues affect people in the global south and in Ireland. We do a lot of campaigning work and policy and research. If you're interested in any of our research papers, you can go on our website. We also do a lot of education work, both kind of informal adult education, sessions like this where we invite experts in. We have our own evening courses. We have a book club if you're interested, which is very informal and online these days, so nice and accessible. In pre-COVID times, we used to have a film club, and we produce targeted subject resources for teachers at second level. Basically, our thinking is that if we want to bring about a world free from poverty and inequality, we need a just financial system. For this to happen, we need people to feel they are confident in understanding the problems of our current financial system so they can take action. So a lot of our work is educated in making people feel, or rooted in making people feel they're educated on these issues, they can take action, they don't need to be experts or economists, and they see the connections. So you might wonder why we're having an event looking at climate change and climate justice, but we've been linking climate and financial justice for a number of years now. For us, it started looking at debt and finance and the connection with climate. We've seen over the last few years a lot of organizations and institutions trying to profit from the money that will be needed to deal with the climate crisis. We've seen a lot of countries, I think Heron is going to touch on this, where they're affected by climate, but the money that's being offered to them is in the form of loans, not grants, with unfair and onerous conditions. And for us, we think at the heart of this coming climate crisis is the fact that we're going to need a way to finance it that's equitable and fair, and that there are people in the current system who will be trying to profit from that. And so we have a very sort of specific niche role in it. We're aware that there are climate experts, and we're not pretending we're those, but we do think some of our experience looking at the financial system has a lot to do with this. What we're hoping to look at tonight is the role that COVID-19 is going to play on influencing all of this. So there's been a lot of talk in recent years about what will constitute a just transition. So how we move to the kind of world we need to in the face of the climate threat, in a way that doesn't disadvantage people with less money, people in a more vulnerable position. But we've seen a huge change to government's approach to finance across the board, what's being loaned, what's being invested, where it's going. And so it's fair to say there are some big question marks about what's happened in the last year when the world has kind of shut down a little bit, if these positions have been moved forward, or what is going on. So that's, I'm going to stop sharing now. And so that's why we've invited our three lovely experts to speak to us. So we're going to start with Sive O'Neill. So Sive is the policy coordinator for the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, where she coordinates their response to climate policy in Ireland. Before working with Stop Climate Change, she provided expert climate information to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action, and she is a regular contribution to Irish news media on these issues and campaign coordinator with Climate Case Ireland as well. So has a lot of background and expertise. So after we hear from Sive, we're going to hear from Diarmuid Torney. Diarmuid is an associate professor in the School of Law and Governance at DCU, where his research focuses on comparative and global politics of climate change, environment, and energy, and he is principal investigator on 2 research projects funded by the Irish Environmental Protection Agency. We are then going to hear from Heron Belfon, coordinator of Jubilee Caribbean. Heron is based in Grenada, where she's the program coordinator of Jubilee Caribbean, who are a newly established network, sort of a sister network to our agency, who were set up by churches calling for a moratorium on debt repayments for these hurricane hit islands, and a debt restructuring process with creditors. So basically, she's right at the center of climate affected islands in the Caribbean who are dealing with the kind of financial inequality in the processes that are being offered to them, and how to get out of the situation that they're in. 3 speakers. What we're hoping to have is each of them are going to give a presentation and introduction. We're going to save questions till the end if that's okay, but do feel free to pop them in the questions and answers box. And if when we're finished with that, we're hoping that we'll have a conversation between everyone. So I'll hand over to Sive now, and yeah, Sive, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maeve, for that introduction. I don't have any slides, unfortunately, so I hope I won't talk for too long, so you can tell me if I'm running over time. And just to say that in the normal world, pre-COVID, our offices in Stop Climate Chaos, which are housed alongside Friends of the Earth, would be next door to Financial Justice Ireland. And so I never got the opportunity to even meet you or get to know my neighbours in Financial Justice Ireland, who are literally next door to us, but hopefully there'll be an opportunity for that. So it's lovely to be here in any case, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, what we can learn from the responses to both, and maybe more by way of asking some questions to trigger some conversation rather than any definitive responses, because I definitely have less expertise in this area. But just thinking back about the climate crisis, the science behind this has been well established now for many decades, and certainly since the IPCC started producing its reports in the early 1990s, it was extremely clear what had to be done. Even though the science became more definite as time went on, there was no doubt by the late 80s, early 90s that there was a human influence on the climate, and that it was clearly as a result of the combustion of fossil fuels, releasing all this stored carbon dioxide, that was stored geologically into the atmosphere, where it is trapped and causing this greenhouse effect and subsequent climate change. So the response globally has been very definitely in the sphere of multilateralism. There's a recognition from the very beginning that countries would need to cooperate to do anything about this. No one country on its own can solve the crisis. Even a big emitter, even a country with high levels of historical emissions, can't on its own solve the problem. That cooperation is essential. However, it was really only, I suppose, by the time the Kyoto Protocol was established, that there was more hard and fast sort of decisions about how to do that, what kind of targets would be appropriate for different types of countries depending on their historical contribution. And the Kyoto Protocol itself made a negligible difference to global emissions in practice. It didn't fully recognize the growth of the Chinese economy. And in any case, there wasn't sufficient buy-in really from developing countries and from some developed countries like the US and Canada, who subsequently pulled out or never ratified it in the first place. So we have this problem of trying to sort of get the cooperation happening in a very meaningful way, where countries, especially those with the wealth, the capacity, and the historical contribution, are willing and able to commit to steep reductions in their fossil fuel use and emissions. And interestingly, in recent years, the relationship with those commitments, if you like, and climate justice and the need for a stepped up climate finance has become much more in focus. So the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, abandoned the idea that there should be set targets for individual countries and instead asks all parties, no matter what their wealth or historical contribution to the problem, to commit to doing its fair share and its best effort to achieve a global target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5. Now, of course, we know since 2018 that even 1.5 degrees of warming is dangerous, and we're rapidly reaching the point of hitting that point and subsequent tipping points that are extremely dangerous, potentially catastrophic. But the link between these getting, I suppose, developing countries to commit to engaging with the mitigation challenge and climate finance was very firmly established in the Paris Agreement. And the principle of climate justice is even mentioned in the agreement. So there's a clear obligation on all countries to do their bit, and a clear onus on developed countries in particular to support developing countries with climate finance. And there's been work streams at the COPs, the various conferences every year, addressing climate finance and also loss and damage to a certain extent, but not very adequately. But how are things going? Well, it's unfortunately the depressing news that emissions are still rising, that we are now looking at having something like 427 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is, I can't even remember the name of the geological epoch that last experienced such high rates of CO2. And it's really no laughing matter, because it's very possible that we are heading into and we are in already a 6th mass extinction as a result of unprecedented biodiversity loss, and the extra pressure on the Earth's systems, or the support systems that support all our lives and all other species, are under threat with these accelerated levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's probably putting it mildly. And we've seen over the last week or so this unprecedented heat dome over Canada and the northwest of the United States, where there's all kinds of extraordinary records being broken in places that have never experienced temperatures as high. And less attention to the fact that in some parts of the world, temperatures in excess of 50 degrees are being experienced in countries like Pakistan, where wet bulb temperatures are exceeding 35 degrees on a regular basis. And that's actually the point at which heat becomes life-threatening. So even though 35 doesn't sound unbearable, it's at the point when you can't physically sweat away the extra heat in your body, and therefore people dehydrate and can actually die. So the focus of the global media, of course, is naturally over there to the Pacific Northwest, and not to the Pakistan problem, where traditionally people are used to high temperatures, but nothing on the scale of what's coming down the tracks, especially when you consider the compounding effects of drought and all kinds of other climate-induced weather changes that are extremely serious. And the other thing that's worth mentioning in the finance side of things is that there is an unprecedented interest in the West in adopting very stringent targets on the one hand at domestic state level, but on the other hand, facilitating these schemes whereby companies or even states can offset their emissions by purchasing carbon credits. And this is a very long, complicated story. There was a series of mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol that were considered not to have been very successful in environmental terms. And these are now being revived under voluntary carbon markets, where companies are setting up various programs claiming that they can offset your emissions. You can develop tree planting programs, for example, in a developing country, determine that it's capturing so many units of carbon and sell those credits to companies so that they can look good, essentially, and claim that they are meeting their own climate targets. And of course, with the advent of some aspects of the Paris Agreement, that facility will be open to nation states to do as well. So instead of getting climate finance, we are actually getting the opposite effect, where the the resources, the land, the economic activity in the global south is there to be exploited by Western companies so that they can look good to their shareholders. And this is not climate finance. This is not finance that's supporting the provision of public goods and climate resilience adaptation in developing countries. So how does this all relate to COVID? Well, obviously, we were all experts on pandemics, but it's just worth reminding ourselves of one small little thing that is pertinent, because it's very likely that we are not seeing the last of this, and there's very likely to be further pandemics in our lifetimes, unfortunately. And that's because of the way the pandemic is linked to biodiversity loss and disruption of ecosystems and interference with other species. And what we're looking at are multiple and interlinked crises that are threatened by our destruction of environmental systems and the destruction of land, essentially, and interference with ecosystems. So the response of countries initially was very self-interested. So instead of getting this kind of global cooperation up and running, we had almost immediately a scramble for personal protective equipment, which has then morphed over the last while into vaccine nationalism. And even if it doesn't seem like it's vaccine nationalism, because from where we're sitting, it looks like all the other countries in Europe have plenty of vaccines, we have plenty of vaccines, so that's all fine and dandy. But of course, we can see that the pandemic is playing out very differently in countries that don't have access to the system of sharing vaccines globally. They're not getting enough of them. They're not able to distribute them. And there's virtually no spotlight on this, that the degree of global cooperation that's required to address this problem is very shaky indeed. And it's also highlighted the fact everywhere, I think, and we've learned this lesson ourselves in Ireland, that our response to this crisis depends on the quality of our public services, particularly public health, and their affordability and access to people who are most vulnerable. So in our case, the government has stepped up and provided universal access to various testing and the procedures, the healthcare that's involved. But that might not necessarily continue into the future. It was clearly a temporary measure designed to respond to an urgent threat. But in many developing countries, they simply don't have the resources to do this. So not only is healthcare patchy, but it's also not affordable for many people. So it's clear that the unprecedented interventions by developed countries in their economies to prop up their the incomes of people who are affected by not being able to work and so on has taught us that it is possible to break all the financial rules. It is possible in a crisis to actually suspend normality and intervene directly to ensure that people have enough food on the table. But we're treating this in a very nationalistic fashion, and we're not seeing those kind of policies being explored in a global sense. And I think that, you know, the combination of the sort of style of politics that we've become used to over the past 5 years and the COVID has forced us to retreat into a sort of politics of self-interest and thinking about ourselves and our own problems as if we're the only country suffering them, and as if that's the only response that's required. Because just like climate, COVID response requires a global response, and it needs to be one based on cooperation and fair shares. The other thing about COVID in comparison to climate is that, and I could be wrong about this, I'm happy to be corrected, but there is a sense in which vaccines are presented as a kind of quick fix, and perhaps they will be. Perhaps if everybody could get the jab, you know, then there would be a quick fix. But when it comes to the climate crisis, unfortunately, there isn't a quick fix. And we're going to need sustained political effort and engagement and a new type of social contract that really invites people to reimagine how we do things, reimagine and rebuild our economy in a very, very different way, because we simply can't fix it by substituting a new technology or an alternative fuel. Those things might have reduced emissions by a certain percent, but they certainly won't get us anywhere close to the kind of net zero scenarios that we should be aiming for. So I'm not sure about the quick fix analogy. Perhaps that isn't even appropriate in a public health. And perhaps public health experts would say, well, actually, that's exactly not the way to think about public health. We need to see the kind of sustained investment in quality public services to address underlying inequities and also other types of public health crises that are not getting a look in. So what do wealthy countries need to do? Well, the most important thing they need to do is focus on getting their emissions down drastically and urgently. They need to do something in the order of 70 to 80 to 90% decarbonisation by 2030 if developed countries were to do anything approaching their fair share. They need to step up their climate finance commitments because this finance is critical to supporting developing countries in not so much mitigation, but adaptation, because the climate crisis is so potentially severe for so many countries on the front line of climate-induced weather change. And finally, I'd just like to say that the geopolitical implications of the COVID crisis and the climate crisis are linked. We can see already that developing countries are showing themselves to be less willing to take on more onerous commitments under the Paris Agreement if they don't see that they're getting their share of vaccines from the global north. So this is an example where we can't just be talking out of one side of our mouth. We need to demonstrate the principles of solidarity and global justice in all our diplomatic affairs, whether it's health or climate. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Maeve, for inviting me here this evening.
Thanks so much, Sive, and lots to unpick there, and I'm sure lots of questions and things, but we'll save some of those till the end. And now, Dermot, if we hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Maeve. Thanks for the invitation to join this very interesting discussion this evening, and hello everyone. One of my fears when Maeve, you asked me to speak at this was that with Sive in particular, we would end up saying exactly the same thing, because Sive and I talk very regularly in various contexts about climate change and climate politics. And so I was slightly relieved when I heard Sive speaking, because not because I disagree with anything Sive said, but because I'm going to say roughly the same thing, but in a slightly different way, in a slightly different order. So hopefully it won't sound like plagiarism or won't bore the audience. But I decided to try to frame my remarks around the three questions that were posed at the end of the notice, the ad for this event. And the three questions were roughly: has COVID-19 hijacked any real chance of a timely Green New Deal or just transition? Is the Global South being left behind and alone to deal with both COVID and climate? And has the pandemic further worsened the potential for global climate action that will protect the countries most vulnerable to changing temperatures? So I propose to just talk through each of those, or my thoughts in respect of each of those questions, which, if you were paying attention to what Sive had to say, is basically what Sive said, but in a different order. So hopefully this won't this will sound new and interesting, or at least repackaged. So on the first question about the implications of COVID-19 for a Green New Deal or just transition for the Global South, I think we can maybe differentiate between the immediate COVID response and the kind of the recovery phase. And I think, if we cast our mind back to this time last year, or the early months of the pandemic, it really felt like a moment of potentially radical change, or at least, all the balls were thrown up into the air. We weren't sure where they were going to land. Everything was kind of up for grabs. So, it seemed like there was the potential for large scale change, system change. The role of experts and expertise was back and fashion. The role of the state was back in fashion. There was as Said described, there was a loosening of the purse strings, but as Said also remarked, the solidarity kind of stopped at national borders rather than being a more global or cosmopolitan solidarity. So while in the early months of the pandemic, it felt like sustainability and climate change had kind of dropped off the agenda completely. It was a mixed picture, and if we compare the response to, or the impact of the current crisis on, if you like, the global policy agenda, if we compare that with the impact of the global financial crisis on the climate change and sustainability agenda, I think climate change and nature and biodiversity and all those related themes haven't quite disappeared from the global policy agenda to the extent that they did a decade or so ago with the global financial crisis, where basically for a period of 5 years or so, there was no talk, good, bad, or indifferent about climate change. It really dropped off the agenda completely, and I don't think that has been the case this time around, or at least not to the same extent. And there have been various efforts to try and ensure that that climate change sustainability remained on the global policy agenda through things like calls for a just recovery, or build back better, build forward better. There were a range of different slogans and an attempt within that to package or to build justice and fairness into that. So that's I guess a first observation, but that's really just saying that compared to what happened during the global financial crisis, things aren't quite as bad, and that's setting the bar pretty low in terms of how we evaluate the period we're living through. I think there's also a temptation, and again, I've hinted at this, of a temptation to return to the status quo. That and Said talked about quick fixes. I think certainly in Ireland, just even around things like reopening of hospitality and reopening of international transport, there is, I think, a fairly widespread view that all we need to do is get back to the way things were before the pandemic. And of course, we know that the world was already a deeply unjust place, and those injustices have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So a return to the status quo just isn't good enough. So moving on then to the second question around whether or not the global south is being left behind, both with respect to COVID and with respect to climate change. Unfortunately, yes, I agree with everything Said said in this respect. I think the answer to that at present is definitely yes, unfortunately. And I think the kind of solidarity that we've seen, and again, Said touched on this, solidarity has stopped at national borders, and in some cases hasn't even gone as far as national borders. Covid-19 and the response has really highlighted and exacerbated existing inequalities, both within national societies and internationally. And I think this is concerning from the perspective of climate change and the kinds of inter and intra-generational solidarity that we need to tackle climate change. Because if we think about those intra and intergenerational justice dimensions of climate change, they're politically quite challenging, because they span, they span the world, they span across borders, and they span across time between generations. Whereas you can make an argument for enlightened self-interest in the case of climate change that that developed countries ought to do much more to fund climate action, both mitigation and adaptation in developing countries, out of a sense of enlightened self-interest. There's also a deep justice argument to that, but there's also an enlightened self-interest that if developed countries want the developing world to come along on the transition to climate neutrality, then developed countries should foot the bill, or should at least go some way towards footing the bill. But that kind of dynamic plays out in a much more immediate sense with respect to COVID, right? So there can be few clearer examples of the case for enlightened self-interest, for international transfers of wealth, and in the case of COVID vaccines, from the position of enlightened self-interest. So it is very clearly in the interests of developed countries that they should vaccinate the whole world, because to use the slogan that we've all heard a lot of, nobody's safe until everyone is safe. And we are in real time seeing this play out in the new variants. The Delta variant is the one that here in Europe we're concerned with at present. And the longer we let the pandemic run on in any part of the world, the more likely we are to see new variants arise that are potentially resistant to the vaccines that we've developed. So there's a really strong enlightened self-interest justification for rich countries to share vaccines with the rest of the world. And I think it's concerning that we're not seeing more of that. That we have COVAX, we have elements, we have bits and pieces of this, but it's really not at a scale that is necessary to vaccinate the world quickly. And we, as I've said, we're seeing vaccine nationalism, and I think that's concerning when we think about how much more difficult those kind of transfers, how more difficult a political sell those kinds of transfers are in the case of climate change versus COVID in the case of the politics of developed countries. And that leads me on to my remarks with respect to the third and final question, which is around how the pandemic affects the potential for global climate action. And again, I'll build on what Sive said previously. So we're seeing this play out, the global politics of this play out in real time in the lead up to the big UN climate change conference taking place in Glasgow at the end of, or towards the end of this year, COP26, in a couple of respects. So there's been an ongoing debate for months now about what format COP26 will take, and whether the participants from developing countries will be vaccinated, and so whether the negotiators will be vaccinated, but also demands from developing countries that their participation, or their active participation, and their commitments around climate change should be conditional on a just and fair allocation of vaccines at a global level. So kind of an explicit tying together of the COVID response with climate change. And the other impact I see in terms of the potential for global climate action is around that question of climate finance that Sive spoke about. And in terms of domestic politics in rich countries, the COVID pandemic, on the one hand, it has caused governments to open the purse strings and to relax rules around debts and deficits. But on the other hand, it has, so much money is being channeled into national responses to COVID that governments are even less willing to contribute to the kind of climate finance that's, as I very articulately put, are crucial for global climate action. And we saw, for example, at the G7 meeting recently, all the leaders at the G7 could come up with was a fairly vague recommitment to the 100 billion total that has been on the table, that has been pledged since 2009 by developed countries. But not a roadmap, not a timeline, not any detail on how that will be delivered. And we know from the available data that the 100 billion that was promised per year by 2020 isn't going to be delivered. Some estimates put it at 80 billion. Others criticize that figure, that it's in fact an overestimate of the amount, but it's going to fall significantly short of the 100 billion. And that matters for global climate cooperation, because, coming back to something I said earlier, the countries of the global south who on a business as usual trajectory will be the emitters of tomorrow are reasonably asking for investments of climate finance, for transfers of climate finance. And if those flows of finance are not forthcoming, then the countries of the global south will very reasonably refuse to commit to climate action targets on the mitigation side. And I'll finish just with an anecdote from my own teaching in Dublin City University. So I haven't done this since before the pandemic, but I used to run a global climate change simulation, negotiation simulation, which was modeled. It was built by a nonprofit based in the US, and it's called the World Climate Exercise. And basically, it's like a model United Nations. You assign students or participants to different delegations. And so I've been running this, ran it with different groups, undergrad, postgrad, for about 5 years. And the result was almost always the same. And there were two really striking outcomes across different cohorts of students from different backgrounds. One was that the outcome really closely mirrored the actual dynamics of the climate change negotiations, which shows that it's an effective teaching tool. But the other was that the outcome that we always reached was that most parts, today's big emitters successfully decarbonized. So the students representing the EU, the US, and even China and India managed to reduce their emissions by mid to late 21st century. And the curve that was much harder to bend downwards was the curve of emissions from what are called other developing countries in this simulation, which is most of the countries of the world, most developing countries. And the reason in this negotiation simulation that played out was that the rich world was never prepared to commit to adequate climate financing, and I think that's a quite accurate reflection of the actual dynamics of the negotiation, and it's one of the issues that I think is going to be at the very top of the negotiating agenda at the UN Climate Summit later this year. So I'll leave it there, Maeve, but I'm happy to come back in the discussion on any of those points.
Thanks, Dermot. Lots more food for thought there. Lots of worrying statistics as well from both of you, but good to focus the mind. So listen, I'll hand over to Heron now, and then afterwards we can all start to have a bit of a discussion. But over to you, Heron.
Okay. Hello. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening to you. Maeve, thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. So I am project coordinator at Jubilee Caribbean, and our mandate here is to advocate for climate, for the sorry, climate change and then the resulting debt. So we advocate with governments across the region to reduce debt loads, and ultimately our goal is that every citizen of the Caribbean, Eastern Caribbean, especially the vulnerable, will be able to enjoy a good quality of life, an acceptable quality of life. So in our everyday lives now, yes, the pandemic is going on, but we see climate change in all of the little things that we do. So even our building codes and everything have changed. While the world has been fighting COVID, we have been fighting COVID and climate as well. And so to go back to the main question, which is, or the topic, whether or not COVID is jeopardizing climate action, I find it, from our perspective, I still find it hard to say definitely yes or definitely no. So I'll give it a soft, it is possible. And so let me explain. In the Caribbean region, most of our debts, Grenada for a fact, after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, 95% of the island was destroyed, damaged. Trees, houses, everything gone, crops, tourism. And so our debt load after that increased so much. In 2005, we had another hurricane. I mean, there was barely anything to be destroyed by then, but there was another hurricane, and the ball just kept rolling on the debt, and it kept increasing and increasing. And so Jubilee Caribbean started in the early 2000s, started on the same focus points as Financial Justice Ireland, right? And so we came out of the same group that you came out of, actually. And that's why, so you find different Jubilee networks all over, Jubilee US, UK, Germany. So yeah, so we share very similar mandates and all of that. And so the World Bank recently stated, and this is April, in one of their briefs in April of this year, stated that in Latin America and the Caribbean, climate activities effects are very much present. And however, most of our resources, most of our energy is going into resilience and implementing strategies and adaptation and everything to deal with, like, to make the impact of the natural disaster less. So before, for example, let's look at a building code. Before we had that passed and before it became a thing, you build your house, however, you build your house of whatever material you decide, whatever specifications. There were instances where we have what you call a maroon, which is where the village or your family, friends will come together, build a house. Every weekend you work on the house. So it wasn't like a construction company building the house from the ground up. And then you have a friend who's an electrician, and your friend will come and put up the wires in the house, that kind of thing. So that was a normal way of life in Grenada. Now, looking at the destruction that we experience and other islands experience, the storms or hurricanes are getting bigger. They're lasting for longer. In 2019, remember Hurricane Dorian just stood there and it wasn't moving at all over the Bahamas. So this is what we're looking at in our future. And so we're now taking the opportunity where we haven't, in Grenada, haven't had a hurricane for a couple of years, to build up so that when a hurricane comes, the destruction is not as 2004 when 95% is completely destroyed. COVID has also wreaked havoc on the islands. We have been making progress. We were making progress prior to 2020 towards achieving 60% debt, the debt ratio, right? The debt to GDP ratio. Grenada was down to 55%. I could be wrong, but the last I checked, it was between 55 to 57% debt to GDP, which means that we were finally in the green. Then COVID came and it just got wiped away. One of the ministers made a comment recently and he said we're just one hurricane away from being completely destroyed. And I think in essence, COVID has taken the attention away from climate, right? Because everyone is dealing with the same thing. We're all fighting the same battles. Doesn't matter if your country is big or small, or whether your country is rich or poor. Another thing that came out of COVID is the disparities between global south and the northern countries in quality of life, in access to resources, again, vaccines. In the Caribbean, in Grenada specifically, we only have one vaccine. We don't have a choice, and we have to take the one that is available. Okay, and then it's not like we have storage facilities so even though we have vaccines, we don't have 113,000 vaccines by two for the 2 doses. And so you have to make an appointment and you get the vaccine, you don't guarantee the second dose. That is our current situation. And COVID has highlighted that. Going back to the Green New Deal and the promise of funds being put aside for Global South to fight climate change, but then the contributions not being made, therefore the funds not being available, it is very traumatizing to an extent, because you're like, oh, okay, we're finally going to get out of this circle, and then you're like, oh no, it happened. So we go from natural disaster to debt to clearing a little bit of debt, another natural disaster, and then you borrow again, and then you just keep going and going and going until, you just hope and pray that this year a hurricane doesn't hit your island. But then a hurricane does hit an island, and all of the islands will now come together, have to reassign resources to help out. With COVID, our resources now going into prevention or healthcare, we need to boost our healthcare system here again. So the amount of energy and funding that would have been put into fighting climate change or advocacy and information and education locally, that has been wiped out. We even had to go into more debt for COVID. As we were speaking about earlier, the tourism sector has been almost completely wiped out. Most of the persons who were employed in tourism were sent home, which means that we had to borrow monies. And Grenada received for $24 million from the IMF. So we need to add that to what we were already paying back. And then stretching that 24 million to cover like lost wages and it was not enough. Let's just say it wasn't enough. So while COVID, sorry, I just lost my place. So one of my main takeaways from the brief that I read, as I mentioned earlier, is that the focus is should be to encourage long-term sustainability, which will lead to shorter recovery periods, because think after a hurricane or a natural disaster, during drought, productivity shut down, then you need to build back. So you borrow to fix what has been broken, destroyed. You have to borrow to maintain the country while we rebuild and while we again get back up to production levels. And so it comes with a warning that millions of Caribbean citizens, and this is from the World Bank, are on the brink of poverty. First from climate change and the effects of climate change, now with climate change and the COVID. And so for us, climate change and COVID are kind of brother and sister now, because they're both affecting us in similar ways, and they're both presenting different challenges and and having to rework how we think, how we work, and everything. So one thing that the pandemic has brought to light is that in our fight for debt relief and moratoriums, we need to now have right next to climate change, we need to have pandemics. Because as the first presenter said, we will be experiencing more pandemics in the future. So this is not a one-off. We strongly believe that this is just a new normal way of life. And every couple of years or so, we'll have to fight climate, fight health challenges. Okay. So what we need here would be support directed towards containment, the fight against COVID, vaccination rollouts, as I mentioned earlier. So in Grenada, we're making slow progress. Our growth is projected to be 1.9% for this year. So as it stands now, there is an even more urgent need for debt relief, and the realization that with little or no funds to take care of the everyday needs of citizens, so the Caribbean is beautiful for visitors, but for those of us to live here and to live here every day, and the struggles and the one after the other, it is a very difficult situation to be in. Funding is scarce. Funding is expensive. So right after the natural disaster, it's very difficult to get concessionary loans on an emergency basis. And so the loans that we do end up getting are very high interest, or what we think we will be getting as a grant or a concessionary loan, the payback, it turns out to be much higher than what we expected. Okay, so in 2000, the economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean shrunk by 9.1% on average. And this is according to ICLAC, and this is the second largest drop after the European Union. So look at it in comparison, the European Union, massive countries, to us here in the little Caribbean, we're right after them in how much we'll be losing. Well, except for Guyana, which is experiencing great growth at the moment. And so the worst of it is Anguilla with 25% reduction. And most of the islands are between 12 to 18%. So on the other hand of this, the positive, that we look for with the pandemic is that the lockdown decreased human activity due to COVID, and which also helped out the climate situation as emissions and pollutions decreased. However, this will go right back to what it was once things go back to the new normal. On the other hand, we are, again, in the region, in the cycle, and this hurricane season 2021 is predicted to be just as active, even more active than last year and 2019. And so as I mentioned earlier, we're just one hurricane away. From June 1st to November 30th in the Caribbean, we live in anticipation, kind of, because you don't know what's going to happen. And so do we prepare, do we not prepare? What exactly? So the experts can say it's going to be an active hurricane season, but there are several islands in the chain. So which island is going to be hit, how badly? And so since hurricanes, we have 5-6 days notice to know that you're directly in the path. That doesn't give enough time to prepare. Okay, and then the devastation that it leaves now, billions and billions of dollars compared to before, it takes way longer to recover from that. And I say all this to say that it is difficult to state definitely whether COVID is jeopardizing climate action or not. It has taken the attention and financial contributions away from the cause, but we are still able to have events like these and meet virtually, advocate for changes in climate bills and procedures. So maybe in the future, we'll look back on this experience here with COVID and climate and the link or the relationship between the two would be more, applicable. So COVID has also presented the opportunity for us here, or those of us who deal with climate justice, to redefine our demands in terms of debt relief and moratoriums, and include new challenges that we're currently facing or that we expect to face in the future, which will leave us better prepared going forward. Thank you for having me. If I missed anything, please let me know.
Thank you, Heron. That was great, and a really strong insight into kind of the challenges that you're facing. And just for those who maybe aren't on our mailing lists and things like that, actually at the start of the COVID crisis, a group of us, we kind of coordinated a group of NGOs in Ireland to try and write to our Minister for Finance and get them to advocate for better debt relief during COVID. And we had a campaign running on that, and it is so disheartening, to kind of see the impact of a structure that thinks that loans, even concessional loans, are somehow a way out of this. But listen, I'll open up now 3 really great presentations, and I feel like you've all given a different perspective on it, and lots of linkages between everything. So I know I have a few questions, but I'll try and hold on for now. So just to see if anyone, if any of the participants have a question, you can either basically you can either use your little raising hand button, and I'll unmute you then, and you can ask it yourself if you're happy to do that, or you can put the question in the Q&A box or in the chat box, whatever works better for you. And while I'm giving you a chance to do that, I might just actually ask if any of the panelists have questions for each other, or commentary, or anything you'd like to add.
I'd like to add, no questions. I thoroughly enjoyed the first 2 presentations. I learned a lot, and it's always good to, be on different panels and get different perspectives and different experiences, because in the Caribbean, we all share the same. And so thank you for that. I really enjoyed it.
I have a question, Maeve, if that's okay. I'd love to ask Heron a question about income supports in the Caribbean. So both Dermot and I mentioned how it's been commonplace in wealthier countries, developed countries, to kind of pump money into households to replace the income lost due to all the lockdowns. But how were the Caribbean islands coping with the lockdowns in terms of the loss of income to households? And was there measures put in place? And is that what the IMF funding was used for?
Right. So the funding from the IMF was specifically towards the persons in the tourism sector who were sent home. So we don't have a social program for to supplement income. We do not have unemployment benefits in Grenada. If you're not employed, you're not employed. However, coming from last year and all of that, there are now talks between the government and our National Insurance Agency to increase our contributions, our monthly contributions, or to increase the cap. Okay, so let me go back. We have unemployment benefits in terms of maternity leave or sick leave. And so it's only up to a certain point. Every month, once you're employed, you pay 11% of your gross salary towards this agency, national insurance. And if you fall ill on work, you get benefits up to a certain point. If a woman gets pregnant, then you get, employment is your salary is 100% shared between your employer and the national insurance up to 3 months. Anything beyond that, then it's up to your employer whether or not you're paid, but the insurance will not cover that. There was absolutely nothing to do with unemployed. And so when you're home, you're home. What the government found out is there were a lot of small businesses like shops and hairdressers, and when everything was shut down, when it was announced that, the government received funding to support the income of those who lost income, all of these, like hundreds of small businesses and thousands came out and say, we've lost our income. And so the monies that came from one specific sector had to be shared amongst everyone else. And so it was very thinly spread. It was supposed to be for several months, but it only happened for 2 months before the funds ran out. And so, yeah, that was our situation last year. And by then, we had no idea when we were going to be, out of lockdown. It was a situation where we had specific days to go shopping. You shop by your last name at certain times, and yeah. So that's how it is here. Hopefully the unemployment part gets off the ground sooner rather than later. But for now, that is not a social luxury that we enjoy here. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heron. I might actually ask a bit of a question as well. I guess kind of particularly toward Dermot and Sive, or whichever one of you feels like answering it, though Heron, do jump in as well. But I suppose kind of coming from sort of the situation Heron has outlined about the perils of the kind of the debt burden and the need for debt relief. I'm just curious about how, because we're always seeing these debates about better financing structures, but there's a strong kind of pressure from a lot of I'm thinking of the IMF, but also I think even the G20 and even it's never really there's never been a strong commitment to grants rather than loans, and I'm just curious as to what you think. I guess, is there the political pressure for that? Where could that come from? Because I suppose part of why we got into this was a feeling, or into looking at these issues, was when we worked with climate groups, we felt that a lot of them weren't necessarily seeing the different sort of domestic groups in Ireland kind of weren't as engaged with the fact that historically, you would get grants rather than loans for a lot of these things, and that concessional loans actually aren't a good thing. Yeah, obviously they're better than non-concessional loans, but you still end up in debt crisis ultimately. So I'm just curious about what you see as the kind of the possibility of that to shift, and where the political pressure would lie to make that happen. Like, why is this not a more central issue?
I'm happy to give it a go, Dermot. If
sure, yeah, you give it a go, and then I'll
yeah.
see if I can add anything.
Well, I was just rooting through my notes here, Maeve, as you were speaking, because I had the privilege of attending the National Economic Dialogue earlier this week. And it was quite interesting, the comments of the Minister for Finance, Pascal Donoghue, and also Michael McGrath, who's the Minister for Public Enterprise. And obviously this is just in an Irish context, so forgive the local story for a change. But obviously we've seen the ECB loosen its financial rules about the fiscal situation across Europe, which has enabled countries to borrow widely in excess. And Ireland's debt at the moment is absolutely staggering. It's in numbers I can't even bring to mind, but it's absolutely staggering. And this is, us coming out of the very painful adjustment after the financial crash. So what the ministers were actually saying was that they never mentioned the word austerity, but that basically debts will eventually have to be paid eventually. And while everything is okay for the moment, at some point we have to start balancing the books. And this came also from the other ministers as well who were present at the meeting. So the reality is that we have been somewhat, excuse my pun now, but sort of inoculated against the fear of austerity over the past year, because of the sense in which the magic money tree has been, dishing out oodles of cash without any obvious limit. But this is not going to continue. And so it is very likely that there will be pressure on even developed countries in the European Union to start balancing their budgets again. And of course, we will be back to the familiar terrain of raising taxes and reducing public expenditure. But when it comes to climate finance, just to answer that point as well, there's no doubt that the climate finance debate is also skewed in favour of loans rather than untied aid, and different countries have their own way of accounting for or describing climate finance contributions. So it isn't obvious what, that there isn't a strict rule about what you actually have to provide in terms of concessionary loans or low interest loans or tied aid or anything like that. So it's clear that from everything Heron was saying so beautifully, that our resilience to any kind of crisis depends on having kind of a long-term sustainable baseline of strong kind of government-backed public services and public finances that aren't sort of unduly constrained by these fiscal rules. And they seem to be so particularly skewed in favor of the lenders, whether they be private banks or large multilateral financial institutions or countries, but the people who have the money get to write the rules, and that seems to be a big part of the problem. So resilience to shocks, whether it's a financial shock or a COVID shock or pandemic or anything else, clearly depends on there being flexibility and immediate supports that are not tied to high levels of interest rates and particular kind of forms of public finance management that will put a brake on public expenditure. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Sive. Dermot, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not a whole lot. I guess I would just mention that in the climate finance space, not only is the understanding that is framed by the people who hold the purse strings of finance being more than just grants, being loans as well, but there's also an emphasis on private finance as well as public finance. So So I would kind of cast the net even broader than that distinction between grants and loans. And it's interesting to hear Sive's reflections on the National Economic Dialogue. I read this morning, Sive, you were quoted in, I think it was Robert Short's piece on the RT News website from yesterday. I think it was at the National Economic Dialogue, and that's the position being trotted out by ministers, because I don't follow it very closely, but there's this kind of ongoing debate in kind of economic circles about whether about the nature of money, basically, and is it true that we need to pay back debt? And I'm not qualified to answer that, but I know there's a diversity of perspectives on that. I think it'll be interesting to watch in the run up to COP26 towards the end of this year how finance plays into this, because the mood music isn't good, particularly on the question of finance and the commitment to that $100 billion. And there seems to be a lot of discussion about whether so some commentators saying that developing countries should refuse to show up to the negotiations if there isn't a commitment to delivering that $100 billion in climate finance. So I think it'll be interesting. It seems to me that in terms of the optics of a successful COP26, the climate finance is really quite at the center. And and this is again kind of parochial politics, but Boris Johnson really wants to make a success of COP26 because this is a flagship of global Britain, right? So I think it'll be interesting to watch that play out. I mean, we know, of course, that Boris Johnson is not particularly good at keeping his promises. But I think it'll be interesting to watch the politics of that in the run up to Glasgow.
Thanks both. So there's another question just in here talking about from Patrick, saying there's good evidence difference in wealth is harmful to all, not just those at the bottom. Could this be a basis for sharing resources yeah, and I think this is true, and in comparison to the poor distribution of vaccines, that we're still affected by variants that affect in countries with low vaccines. I mean, and this is like a really good point. We're so interconnected. And yes, studies time and time again, we would all, I think, do so much better if we did just invest in climate protection in the global south, and getting ourselves equally protected. It goes back to the point you made at the beginning, Diarmuid, about the fact that you know, solidarity needs to go past the borders. We're all interconnected. But does anyone have any responses to that? Or thoughts how we can inspire some acknowledgement of this, maybe from people who'll be going to COP in a while?
I agree. I think it's a really good point. Mike Ryan from the WHO is really strong on this point, and just emphasizing our interconnectedness, and as the question suggests, I think one of the things the pandemic has taught us is that those of us in the rich world, living lives of privilege, we can't insulate ourselves. The world is so interconnected now. So I guess we just need to keep repeating that message and amplifying voices that make those arguments. So events like this, where we get to hear perspectives from perspectives that those of us in the rich world don't often get to hear, are really really helpful and enriching to our own national discussions here, because I think we would all confess that we're pretty inward looking in our own national debates, and so if we can hear more perspectives from elsewhere, that enriches our discussions.
Great. So one more question from Valeska. So thanks for the great presentations. Next step in relation to climate-induced migration in the global south. What can governments do about the intense flow of migrations in the post-COVID context?
I think that's a great question, because it's very obvious that the attitude of the global north is to shut borders to migrants as a response, and that's clearly in breach of every sort of understanding of climate justice and what that demands. There is a weakness in the international what would you call it, regime for managing migration, in the sense that the refugee status is pretty much the only way to cross border and attain a legal status. It's very, very difficult, at least, to secure a legal status in any other way, especially at the moment. And countries are making it harder all the time to apply for that kind of status. And it certainly doesn't really capture the kind of situations that many people fleeing climate-induced change and stress, or climate-induced migration, it's just simply not going to accommodate that need. So this is something that, there's been quite a bit of discussion about in academic discourse over the past 10 years, but it hasn't resulted in anything that I can see as a kind of coherent response. Again, countries are very much acting on the basis of what they consider to be their self-interest. So Germany's response, say, for example, to the Syrian crisis, was at least partially motivated by its desire to bring in more foreign workers to support its economy. And as soon as they had achieved what they thought that they might need or be able to cope with, they immediately closed the borders. Certainly other countries have done so as well. So the experience from that crisis in 2015, 2016 has shown us that the tolerance of many countries is easily stretched, and in the absence of a cooperative regime, breaks down very quickly. So as soon as one country in the kind of chain of countries through which people might be migrating decides to close its borders, that's often used as a way for other countries to say, well, there you go, we just can't do anything more about it. And that's a completely inadequate response. So it's quite obvious that what we're going to be witnessing over the next few decades is millions of people on the move. And it might not necessarily hit Europe initially, although we have experienced a little taste of it perhaps from North Africa and the Mediterranean, where, you know, soaring temperatures in the summer are going to make it extremely difficult for people to survive and survive the kind of droughts and very difficult growing conditions. So you can see what might follow. Looking at what happened in Syria, that people flee to cities, cities can't cope, people leave cities looking for opportunities elsewhere. So the links between climate, political problems and civil unrest are very well documented, but they're always going to be there are always going to be multiple reasons why people move. And so we need an international mechanism, or even regional mechanisms, because it is going to be regional in scope as well, that help to absorb these stresses and just learn to provide kind of sponges so that people can move, they can be absorbed, and they can be resettled, and also supported in doing that in ways that are safe, that protect human rights, and that also give people economic opportunities into the future. So there's quite a bit of work done on this at international level in the theory of it, but no political initiative that I'm aware of that is attempting to address it in a serious way. And I think the prognosis, at least in the short term, is really grim, but perhaps others know more than I do.
I might ask Heron, is it something that you're aware of in the Caribbean as, you know, something that's already started happening already, or is it something governments are concerned about?
We are aware of it, you know, as something that is happening. However, our migration is of a different type here in the Caribbean. We're not climate induced migrating yet. What we suffer from now is most of our educated citizens are leaving. And so less than 5% of people like myself would go away to study and then come back to the Caribbean. Most of us, almost all of us, well, those who travel would remain where they travel or move to another developed country. And so from my year at my undergrad year at university, from those of us who went on to do grad school, who traveled overseas, only 5 or 6 of us came back. And I'm talking about close to 100 persons. So that's the migration that we're experiencing now, where most of our educated and our strong persons that we could have had to, you know, help with our advocacy and movement and having things happen, they're gone now. So we're not there yet. However, given the way things are going, we will be seeing it in the region soon. Yeah.
Thanks, Heron. Dermot, did you want to come in on that?
The story that Heron just told sounds very familiar from an Irish perspective, right? That, you know, not in recent decades, but that story of mass emigration and brain drain and people not staying. You know, I remember. So I was a university student in the late 90s and early 2000s, and, you know, that was at the kind of peak years, or some of the peak years of the Celtic Tiger. But our lecturers told us at that point that, you know, a couple of decades previously, you know, half or more of an undergraduate class would leave and would never come back to Ireland, or, you know, would return for visits, but would make their lives abroad. So it sounds like there is and even similar things happen during the global financial crisis with emigration. So it sounds like there are aspects of shared history, though not or shared experience, not at the same period in time. On the question of kind of climate migration, climate refugees, I think Saib is right about there being lots of good theory, but not much in the way of practical measures. The German Advisory Council on Global Change published a very good report a couple of years ago on the idea of a just and in time transition. So they were trying to marry the concept of just transition with the concept of urgency. So basically that we need to not let concerns around making the transition just take away from the urgency, because that displaces the injustice from, and this is in a developed country perspective, that displaces the injustice from the rich world to the poor world. But why I mention it in this context is one of the ideas they put forward in that report is what they called a Nansen passport, but it would be a passport given to people who are displaced because of climate change, and would enable them to seek international protection. So I think that's one of the closest examples I came. It's not a government, it's not a government policy, but it's not purely in the realm of academia. But I would agree with Saib that a lot of the thinking in this area has yet to kind of transfer into the policy arena. But if climate projections continue, or if climate projections turn out to be in any way accurate, the scale of global migration is going to look like what we called the migration crisis in 2015 in Europe. It's going to make that look like a walk in the park.
Can I ask, so I don't think I've missed any more questions, but please put your hands up or put in the chat box if I have. But I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time, so I might just finish on one question for all three of you, if that's okay, which is basically for the people here and for people who support us, for organizations like us, if you were to tell activists or people who want to take one kind of action or write to their member of parliament or their representative around kind of climate finance and things that seem achievable in the kind of next period of time that we have, the run up to the COP, if we were to run a campaign or anything like that, what is the one ask that you think is either the most, maybe just the most important? Whether or not you think it's politically achievable or not probably shouldn't be the main consideration, but what do you think is the one discrete thing we should be asking for and raising up to politicians at the moment in this space? I should have given you more time to think about that one.
Well, I'm just going to jump in straight away and say that developed countries in particular in the lead up to COP need to step up big time in relation to climate finance, and they need to restore and add to the climate finance that was already committed but hasn't been delivered. And this finance needs to be in the form of untied aid, just as we were discussing, not loans, and not directed solely at mitigation. It must support countries, and Heron articulated all the reasons why. It's the recovery from hurricanes and disasters that are related to climate change that cost such extreme amounts of money and sometimes can drive poor countries into debt. So in order to support that, we need to be funding countries in adaptation efforts and also resilience, and not just mitigation. And that's something where developed countries are falling short. And in relation to Ireland, the quality of Ireland's overseas aid is considered to be really excellent. It ticks all the boxes, but the actual amounts are paltry. I think it's just runs to a few tens of millions, and it's a very, very small amount of money, and we need to radically increase that and get to our 0.7 of GDP that we promised many, many years ago. So we're good at setting targets, but we're not good at actually delivering on them. And this is one of those times when, you know, we need to demonstrate our sincere commitment and solidarity with developing countries. And we cannot continue to expect them to step up in relation to climate change if we're not doing our fair share.
Everything that Five said.
Okay, from our perspective, that would be, oh, I'm sorry, Jeremy, are you going to add? No, okay. Sorry. From our perspective, I would have to say debt relief and debt swaps. So for debt forgiveness, so you tell us, okay, fine, we understand, and therefore we can write off a certain amount to begin with and work from there. Obviously, there should be measures in place for monitoring evaluation to ensure that we're following policies and using the new redirected funding for what we're supposed to be. So that would be it for us, debt swaps, debt forgiveness, yes.
Thank you, that's really clear. Thank you, everyone. I've just popped, for those of you who can see in the chat box, I've popped a quick evaluation. Our funders are very keen on everyone doing that, both to show that we all came here tonight, but it's also a really great way for us to know what kind of further events you might like us to do or anything like that. If you're interested in keeping in the loop in any future campaigns we might run on this, do sign up to join our mailing list via our website, which I'll pop it. It's just financialjustice.ie. But the main thing is just to say thank you so much to our panelists, Diarmuid, Sive and Heron. It was really great to hear from the three of you. It was really good to get that perspective. I think it highlights just how important everything is and how critical the next while is, as I suppose it has been for about the last 15 years on climate, but we've been kind of struggling to catch up to that realization of where we're at. But hopefully the coming months and the COP and all these things will focus a bit of attention to that. But thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who came, and we'll draw it to a close now. We'll follow up by email, but yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye everybody, have a great evening. Bye.